Welcome everyone. It's great to see you all today, and good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. I'm Yael Shapira, OLAM's Director of Network Engagement and Programs, and I'm excited to delve into yet another topic of ethical best practices through our Aspire program. If you haven't done so yet, please introduce yourself in the chat and please keep yourself muted. Next slide. So you are invited to learn more about OLAM's Aspire program on our website if you haven't done so yet. There you can check out various information, including 4 ethical spectrum tools that we developed in the topics of ethical communications, community engagement, monitoring evaluation, and global volunteering. We're excited to have just launched the Aspire microgrants that are aimed to support your ethical practices work in a variety of ways. Each partner organization can apply for up to $1,500 per year in microgrants that can include to use for hiring a consultant to support your work, including bringing in someone to support your informed consent work. So on our website, there's also a list of recommended consultants, and we hope you can take a look at that. We also have resource lists that include links to dozens of existing videos, blogs, guides, papers, and more that were created by organizations and professionals around the world. Also, take note in our calendar of events of upcoming webinars and workshops, such as today's, that provide practical ways for you to improve your ethical practices. Please email me if you would like a recording to any of our previous webinars that you may have missed. Next slide. Specifically, please save the date for our next Aspire webinar on March 30th that will focus on involving local partners in your monitoring and evaluation work. It's an opportunity to think about the steps you can take to ensure your organization's M&E is inclusive, is not top-down, and it allows for your community partners and staff to set the agenda for your evaluation and decide what success looks like for them. The link to RSVP will be in the chat shortly. Next slide. And now on to today's webinar. It falls under the topic of ethical communications, and it's relevant to all organizations who communicate about the work they do with people and communities. So basically, all organizations. In our communications ethical spectrum that you'll find on our website, the second commandment is to get informed consent. And it offers 3 examples of how organizations can move from just beginning to leaders. We've defined a leading organization as one that has obtained consent for all its materials, has made it clear that people can opt out and withdraw their consent, and that consent is requested in culturally appropriate ways. You'll hear about this and a lot more in today's presentation. I can share that in my own experience working in different countries, I have asked people to sign consent forms for using their images and stories, but then I filed the forms away, never to be seen or thought of again. So today I will learn together with you about how to ensure that the consent process is done more ethically. Next slide. With that, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker and facilitator, Kate Watson, joining us from London. For the past 12 years, Kate has worked across the UK and internationally to design, manage, and facilitate a portfolio of participatory photography and visual communications, development and advocacy programs with underrepresented communities, and she supported NGOs to communicate their stories powerfully and ethically. Most recently, Kate worked as Senior Project Manager at Photo Voice. Kate is also an Associate Lecturer at the London College of Communication. So please take note of your questions throughout the presentation, and there will be time for Q&A in the end. If we don't get to all of your questions, Kate has offered kindly to stay a few minutes after for those who want to stick around and ask and hear more from her. And with that, I'll pass it on to Kate. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate.
Great, thank you so much for having me, and thank you for everyone for joining. And just bear with me, I am just going to share my slides. Just to check, Gail and Naomi, can you see my slides up now?
Yes.
Fantastic. So I'm really excited to be part of this OLAM program and thinking about how we can improve our ethical practices. And today we're going to be thinking about informed consent and how it applies to your organisations and how you gather and share stories from the communities that you work with, and specifically how you can support them to have agency in this process. Informed consent is a complex and nuanced subject, as are the ethical considerations and practical considerations that underpin it. So please do consider this an introduction to the topic, but I hope to equip you with some knowledge and practical tools which can either help you begin to implement informed consent within your organisation or begin to strengthen the existing approaches that you already have. As Yael said, there will be time for questions at the end, but if anything is relevant and you want to bring it up, I'll try and keep it as informal as possible. So please do use the chat function or use your microphones. And in the second half, we're going to have time to do some case study group work. So it won't just be me speaking all the time, which I think will really sort of strengthen the learning. Thank you for the introduction, Yael. I think you've kind of covered everything. Yeah, my practice sees me wear many different hats, but at its core, it's about my passion for supporting communities to ethically represent themselves and share their stories, and really supporting other organisations to help them do so. Sorry, just having some trick with my slide. So consent, I'm sure you're all familiar with the term. It's the permission for something to happen or an agreement to do something. But what I'd like us to think about is how that differs, or how the similarities it has with informed consent. So what what Naomi's going to do now is post a link in the chat, and I'd like you to think about how we define informed consent. So what are the words or phrases that come to mind when you think of informed consent? And just pop those in the boxes, which you'll see when you follow the link. It's a really quick exercise, so just please put in the first thing that comes to your mind.
Sorry, Naomi, I think you put in the wrong link. If you can re-put the Mentimeter. Sorry about that.
So can you all see that link now?
It is just one moment. Okay, yes, great. Now it's on the chat.
Okay, great. So I can see your words coming through now. Time consuming, interesting, and burdensome. Yeah, I think these are some of the challenges as an organisation. So it's about understanding and power dynamics. Fantastic. So a lot of you putting in understanding and agreement. Really interesting. So it looks like a lot of you are already familiar with this term. And I imagine as a group, there's a range of experience. So please do lend upon that, as well as the information that I will be sharing with you. Transparency, wonderful. Really nice. I'll leave this now and I will screenshot that, and perhaps we can share it at the end. And if we have the time, reflect on that and see if our understandings have changed following the work that we'll be doing. So I'll just go back to my slides now. So informed consent is a term that signifies that consent has been given freely and that all of the stakeholders involved have the capacity to understand the implications. This includes the potential risks and benefits of their agreement, to have their information, and that might be visual, audio or written, collected, documented and shared in line with any privacy or confidentiality wishes. So why is it important then? Well, informed consent is really the cornerstone of ethical practice. If we want to uphold the values of protection and respect, fully informed consent is crucial, and it's really necessary to protect contributors from harm and safeguard their well-being. And I'll give you an example of this when informed consent hasn't been obtained correctly. I worked once with an international organisation that works with HIV prevention, and as an organisation it was given consent from one of the beneficiaries to use a photograph of her to talk about the local advocacy work that she did as an HIV positive woman around the right to sexual health and reproductive health services. However, when they showed the photograph, the caption that they put alongside it also disclosed that the woman was a former sex worker. And she had not consented to this. She didn't mind her HIV status being shared, but she had not consented to that information being showed and being attached to her image. So the organised actions clearly went against, the principle of do no harm, and they put her at risk, both her personal safety at risk, but also the work that she was doing within the country and the activism that she was doing in a country where sex work was criminalised. So really important that there's a full understanding that can lead to consent being informed to protect the communities that we work with. But it also protects us as an organisation. So legally and professionally, it's our responsibility to ensure that our communications are ethically compliant both to data protection guidelines, but also as an organisation to any ethical communications guidelines that we have. And not doing so can have really negative repercussions. So that might range from just the practical challenges of having to withdraw an image or text if it's not been consented to, right through to potential legal action or disciplinary action when we haven't gone through the correct processes. So thinking about how we protect ourselves as organisations as well. But I think as well, really importantly, we really want to ensure that the processes of us gathering stories is not extractive, and that the communities that we work with are active participants in it. And in doing that, it's going to allow our stories to be both more powerful and effective pieces of communication. So these are some of the reasons why informed consent is really important. So if we understand that it's important, what is it that makes consent informed? Well, central to ensuring that this consent is informed is the provision of the following information that you can see on the slide, and making sure that not only is it communicated, but doing our best to ensure that it's also understood by those that we're communicating it to. So what the organisation wants to film, photograph or interview, what is the purpose of them telling their story? And why the organisation wants to film, photograph, what this will lead to. So what are the resulting communication outputs going to be, and how and where they will be shared? So is this going to be included in a report that's shared internally in your organisation, or is it part of a global social media campaign? So who are the audiences for these communication materials too? And how long the materials will be kept by the storyteller. And this is really important so that we can manage the expectations of the people's stories that we're telling. It must be made clear that consent can be rescinded at any point, and that the organisation will stop sharing the materials from that point on. However, it's also really important that it's communicated that once those materials are in the public domain, particularly once they're online, it's actually very difficult to stop them circulating. So there needs to be a full understanding of that. And importantly, if we're telling them that they can withdraw consent, we need to provide information on how they start that process. So how can they withdraw consent? Now, data protection guidance is going to vary from country to country, and I think there's a real mixed group here. So my first point is that it's really key that you understand the rules in the country in which your organisation is based or where it operates. However, most guidelines as part of good practice stipulate that this information on the slide, the who, the what, the how, the where, and how to withdraw consent, is included in the communications around informed consent, and that you demonstrate that it has been communicated to the potential contributor when you go through the process of obtaining consent. I would recommend that all of the information on this slide is contained in a project description or a project blurb that you share with contributors before you begin capturing any of their stories and before you bring out any of the consent capturing tools, so the written forms or the videos. And that's just to give them a full understanding of what you intend to do with the story gathering. And we'll talk about that more, about how it forms part of the informed consent process. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because we will pick up on this in the case study work that we're going to be doing later. But how do we understand that this information is understood? So what are some of the factors that can affect someone's ability to comprehend, communicate, and make decisions around informed consent? So 4 of the main ones are age, capacity, intoxication, and coercion. So on age, again, this will vary depending on where you're operating. But if someone is considered a minor, they cannot give informed consent, and therefore you must seek consent from a legal parent, a parent or a legal guardian. It's really important that your organisation has a policy on this. So as part of best practices, a lot of organisations will have 18 anyone under 18 as needing that parent or guardian consent. So inform yourself on the context in which you're working. And then I'm going to move on to coercion because we'll look at the other 2 in the case studies. But I'd like us to think beyond coercion as an explicit force and instead to some of the more subtle forms of pressure that someone might feel when they're giving consent. So power imbalances are inherent to development work and community work, and a potential contributor might feel pressure to tell their story or to share their story because the content gatherer, they want to please the content gatherer, or the content gatherer has travelled internationally to hear their story. They might feel pressure because of a perceived risk that resources will be withdrawn from the organisation if they don't share their story. And, you know, when we're working with vulnerable individuals, there might be a poverty of choice, particularly if the sharing of content is incentivised. And that's why it's so important that we provide multiple opportunities for the potential contributors to express their concerns, to ask questions, to let you know about their circumstances that might affect their capacity or where they might feel pressure. And, you know, that could be as simple as asking, is there anyone you don't want to see in this photograph? Or would you be more comfortable with me recording your story if I did A, B, or C? So it's really important that we work with the potential contributors and any local partners on the ground to understand the individual circumstances and any of the factors that might limit someone's capacity for voluntary consent. So there are various methods that we can use to record that consent has been given, and that might be written in the form of a written consent form, or it might be the contributor gives it verbally and we record that with audio, video, or by a witness in the organisation. But I imagine for most of you, because most larger organisations will use written consent forms, and they do so for the following reasons. So written consent forms are a simple record which, as I said, are there to protect you as an organisation, but also to provide information to the community group that you're working with so that they have all of the information and that enables them to have agency in making an informed choice to either give consent or withhold consent. Often a form is the most efficient way to contain that information. And as I said, data protection guidelines will often require you to demonstrate that that information has been provided. And again, a form is kind of a simple, efficient way to do so. Another point is, from my experience working, gathering stories from communities, there can often be a lot of suspicion around your motives as a content gatherer. And this might be because they've had negative experiences with either media organisations or other NGOs in the past, and they don't want to risk misrepresentation again. By demonstrating that you as an organisation have the appropriate policies in place to record consent ethically, you can help reassure contributors of your intentions as an organisation, and a written form can be an effective way to do that. I should caveat that, however, with that sometimes a written form can have the opposite effect, and it can be quite intimidating to communities. And that's why it's so important that there is a process and a discussion that happens before you bring out any paperwork. And I call this the process of informed consent, and we will look at that in more detail later. So I want to think now about practical steps you can make. We're sticking with written consent forms, and practical steps that you can take to make sure that the consent forms that you use are more meaningful and more accessible. And I don't know if anyone had any ideas that they just wanted to kind of put out in the chat before we look at my summary points about how we would do this. I can't actually see the chat function. Yeah, is there any coming up?
Not yet. Yes, provided in advance so folks can digest or think about it.
Yeah, fantastic point. So, you know, if you're dealing with a form and it's quite text heavy, then we would never ask someone just to read through that and then sign it on the spot. It should be given in advance, either the form or a project description, blurb containing all of that who, what, why information, so that they can review it, so they can ask questions, so they can seek advice and speak to partners if they need to.
I'll add on my own that it's the right person is the one that giving, kind of explaining the consent forms. It's someone from the community who really knows how to talk to people. And someone just, Jacob just added, translated into local language.
Yep, absolutely. So someone cannot give informed consent if the information isn't provided in their own language. So it's not just translating forms and project information. Ideally, it's about having an interpreter there as part of your content gathering team, so they can take part in those discussions and that dialogue that's so important to informed consent.
And just finally, use images where possible for illiterate communities.
Yeah, that's a really good point and good suggestion as well. So I have here, like, we should never assume literacy levels with the communities we're working with. So work with local partners to understand those factors that might limit their capacity to understand and communicate the information. I've added some more here, and I'm just going to pick out a few. So I think one of the first ones is there is no standard consent form, and I really strongly believe this. While every form must contain a certain level of information, we need to be thinking about the ways in which we communicate that information so that it's accessible and meaningful to the potential contributor. And that's why every project that I've ever worked on has had a different variation of a consent form. So at the end of this, I'm going to be providing you with example template consent forms, which I would encourage you to go have a look at, but I would really encourage you to think about your specific projects, the communities you're targeting, and tailor the language that you're using to make it appropriate for those groups. Another point that I wanted to pick up on this one was sometimes we're working on projects which are projects in their own right, but where content may be gathered. Maybe we want to document those projects and we want to create a series of images which do so. And we need to have consent for the community members to take part in the project, and then consent for us to use their images or the materials that they share. And these are two very different things, but yet they're often conflated. And I believe it's really important that separate consent is sought for these, that there is a distinction made between them, because potential contributors should never feel like their participation in the project is contingent on them sharing their information or sharing their images or their stories. So make sure that there's a distinction within your consent forms around participation in the project and sharing of materials, or use separate consent forms. And just on this, I would always wait until the end of the project, until the participant has the opportunity to review the final materials that have been produced to decide whether they want to give in consent. So never asking for blanket consent at the beginning of a project before we know what those materials will be. And then just the final point on this, I've said design capturing, consent capturing tools in line with data protection laws. So as I've said, these are going to be different depending on where you're based and operate. However, it's really key that our tools that we use, be it a form or a video, provide a certain level of information that meets those requirements. So for example, the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, which is the legal framework for the processing, the gathering, processing and sharing of personal information in the EU and the UK, requires you, as I said, to demonstrate that you have provided the who, the what, the why, the for how long, and how to withdraw consent information. So you need to make sure that if you're using forms, that information is captured. GDPR also provides guidelines on how that information is stored, both physically and digitally. So as an organisation, you need to be aware of what those requirements are and make sure that you're incorporating them into the consent capturing tools that you're creating, and also that they're in line with any ethical communications guidelines that your organisation has in place. So we spent a lot of time talking about forms and the information required for consent to be informed. But we must always remember that these forms or the videos or the audios are not in fact actually consent, but only evidence that the participant is consenting. So to be clear, a consent form is not the same thing as consent. As I've put here, obtaining informed consent is a process, and it's an essential multi-stage process that must be responsive and meaningful to the community groups that you're working with. It's not enough to go into a situation wanting to help. If we really want to follow the principle of do no harm, we need to be aware that we're potentially asking community members to take risks. And they also, in turn, need to let us know what those potential risks could be and share that information. And in that sense, it's a dialogue and it's a bi-directional process. It's not extractive or it shouldn't be extractive. So we understand consent is a process. It's a meaningful dialogue between contributors and content gatherers and partners. However, to add a little bit more ambiguity, just like the rule that there's no standardized consent form, there's also no standardized process. However, I do think there's key steps that you can take to make sure that the informed consent that you obtain is obtain or don't obtain is meaningful. And I've described these in the following diagram. So I'll just let you have a quick look at that and then I'll talk you through it. Okay, so the first stage here is information provision. This is about identifying potential contributors and providing them with the project information and the intentions of the content gathering. So its purpose, the people involved, and ideally at this point you'd be sharing relevant examples of existing content so that they can have a real understanding of what you're hoping to do. And this should happen well in advance of any content gathering or any recording of consent. And then we move to stage 2, which is verbal consent. So once you've provided the context for the story gathering, participants can agree to either participate or not participate. But to be clear here, they're not participating to share their content at this point, just that they're willing to kind of go forward with the project as you provide more information. And if you've done step one well and kind of thoroughly provided the information, that's going to really help you facilitate the second stage. So the third stage is the ongoing discussion, and thinking again as consent as a process. This is perhaps the most important stage. It's an ongoing dialogue with contributors and partners to ensure that they fully understand the intentions of the work and the implications of them if they do decide to share their story, their information, or their image. And this discussion is going to be unique to whatever context you're working in or community group you're working with. But I'd like you to see it as a real opportunity for you to now tailor the conditions of the consent to the needs of that community group. So perhaps they would like to share their image, but they'd like to use a pseudonym when it's credited. Or maybe they're comfortable in having their interview shared as a case study, but they don't want that to go on the internet. So you can shape the project now to the needs, now that you have a better understanding of the community group. So it's only at this point that the potential contributor has a true understanding and can make an informed choice. So they can either accept and decide to contribute their materials or decide to leave the project. So if they do accept, you're now ready to record consent. So you want to be showing the final materials back with the potential contributor, reviewing them, checking again that they're happy to share them, and then recording the entire process, be that through your video, your written consent form, or your audio, and making sure that all of the relevant information is captured. The information, the who, the what, the why that we discussed, and also the contact details of both parties, the organisation, the contributor. And then you're ready for the final stage, which is the follow-up. And this stage is really crucial, but again, it's often overlooked. This follow-up could take the form of a personal encounter. It could be an email or a phone call. And when it happens, will be specific to the project that you're working on. I tend to try and get back in touch with participants relatively soon after the project, just as the materials are finalised, because this is an opportunity for them to, not last chance because they always have the right to withdraw consent, but to check in that they're definitely happy for those to be shared now that they've seen the final products as well. It also might make sense to revisit a project if the context has changed. So if you have case studies where you've interviewed a community group where they're speaking about an issue that perhaps now there has been like a recent crackdown by the government on, you would want to go back and check in with the group, given that the context changed, are they still happy to share their stories? I think it's also really important to see this as a bit of an opportunity. If you're sharing the work in new contexts, it might be that it's possible for you to involve the contributors more widely as active participants. So I've worked on projects where a conference has come up where they've said, I'd love to see those images in the conferences. And then what we've done is go back to contributors, check that they're happy with that. It will have been captured in the form that it could be part of conferences, but also ask if they would like to take part in that conference, if that's possible. Could they come and stand by their work and talk about it? Would that be appropriate? Would that be something they're interested in? So again, thinking of this process as a supporting agency rather than being extractive. Don't worry, we will be sharing these slides afterwards because I realise there's a lot of information in this one. Okay, I've spoken a lot and I think now it would be great for you to work in groups and think about how some of this guidance could look in practice. So what I've done is create 4 different case studies of scenarios that are similar to ones that I've encountered in my own practice around obtaining informed consent. And you're going to go into breakout rooms and we'll share a link where you can see where your case study is. And you'll have 10 minutes to discuss the case study. And we'll give you some direction on things that you might want to discuss. And then we're going to come back as a group and everyone will have just under 5 minutes to feedback on their discussion. There aren't right or wrong answers with these case studies, so please just use it as an opportunity to discuss and learn from the others in your group. If we start with scenario A, so the person who was given the role of feeding back for scenario A, just give us a bit of a couple of minutes on just what was discussed in terms of this case study, and the rest of you just have a quick look through what they were working with. So that's group number 1 who were working on.
Sure.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Andrew. Ours was a really great example of something very contemporary, apropos. Basically, humanitarian organization you can see here documenting protests in Ukraine, and there's 2 protesters who are okay with their photographs being displayed to kind of show the anti-war movement in Russia. So we had a lot of discussion points, and I think some of the things we talked about was, is there kind of like a difference for the process for informed consent in a dynamic humanitarian situation? Like, we saw on the screen, there's this process, the 7 steps. Is there a shortened or abbreviated version if you don't have the time to do all that? Like in the middle of a protest, let's say. Also, we talked about, this is a big protest. There's 2 people, but there might be a lot more people in the background. So how do you account for all of them? And on that note, one really interesting point was, do we have to show people's faces? Could we still get the message across while simultaneously maybe blurring their faces or something? Could you still tell a story that's powerful? That's something we asked ourselves as well. We also said, to what extent is like the risk, assessing risk. So if people are identified, what is the risk to them in this situation? Who knows, it could be pretty large. And another thing we talked about was possible follow-up. So in a place like Ukraine, maybe it's a more developed country, there could be internet, maybe sometimes it's working, sometimes it's not during this war, but could you quickly follow up with the people you're talking to say, is this what you had envisioned? Is this okay? Give us your final thumbs up. And then the last one other thing was, how can we be sure that what we publish is what the participants or what the 2 people had wanted, that it's portrayed correctly in however we publish it. And yeah, I think that was just about everything in my notes.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've raised some really, really good points. I've got notes in front of me and you've kind of picked up on all of the key points there. It's obviously a really difficult situation. There's a high amount of risk. And as an organisation, you're trying to follow this principle of do no harm, and clearly exposing these processes could potentially put their compromise their personal safety and well-being, and there could be really negative repercussions. That said, they have the legal freedom, right to freedom of speech, and that should be recognised. We don't want to be paternalistic as an organisation either. But I think some of the strategies that you spoke about is there a way of telling this story using different photographs? Could we re-photograph to kind of put the same message across, but in a way that also protects the identity of the protesters is really important. And you suggested maybe blurring out their faces. Some organizations do that. I personally kind of, when I see blurred or pixelated faces, I kind of associate that with like TV crime programs. And so we have to kind of be careful about what that message visually carries as well. But I think thinking about how we could tell that story differently is really important. Your point around the process that I described is a really good one. I guess I kind of, the process I gave you was ideal, informed consent as a process, when we have the luxury of a lot of time. And that's obviously different in a humanitarian context. But I think if we're aspirational, we can still try and take those steps. So there could be a discussion, once you've taken the photograph, you can show it to the participants, you can check, you can find out more about their individual circumstances. And then ideally there would be a way, as you said, to follow up with them. And that can be more challenging in different contexts. But, if you can get an email address or social media, even in Russia, there will still some people will have access to this. And I think that's important. This is part of a photo essay. So about them being happy with the message, well, I think they need to see what the text that goes alongside it is. That can change the meaning significantly. So I think that was kind of the main points that you made. There's obviously lots more, but that was really great. So well done, group one. And then perhaps we can move on to the next group. And thank you, Andrew. So group two, we're working on scenario B. Can someone feedback from that group, please?
Sure, I'm happy to. Hi, I'm Jill Elias. So our case study was about an organization that provides harm reduction programs for adults involved in substance misuse. They've been leading these workshops, and it has resulted in these short films that they're filming with the users narrating their experience. And now the organization wants to use these videos for a fundraiser event. So in theory, these people's voices will be shared with potential program funders and individual donors to the organization. So there's a lot of things to keep in mind. This is another very layered case study. We talked a little bit about the fact that we don't know how their voices will be shared. So there wasn't any evidence that people's voices will be, changed, as you talked about in the previous case studies. So their identities potentially would not be protected, and this might have legal ramifications for the participants. It could impact their ability to get jobs, things of that nature. So those are things that we discussed. So we talked about how important it is that the users would have the ability to review the content once it's filmed. So perhaps while they're in this program, they say, yes, they're okay with it, but then after going through the workshop and potentially revealing something, they might, go back and change their decision. So it would be really important to be continually going back to these participants and making sure that they're involved throughout the whole process before the event. Other decisions that need to be made. We need to make sure that they understand exactly how the footage would be used. So would it be used just one time for this particular event, or is this footage going to be kept on hand and repurposed for other reasons? Will it just be shared with this particular audience, and will they know who's in that audience specifically, or could it be shared more widely? And we also talked about the organization being able to determine who really has the capability to provide informed consent for this particular project. I'm trying to think if there's anything else I missed. So
I mean, you've covered a lot of, again, the key points. So thank you, Jill, and thank you, Group 2, for your work on it. Yeah, another kind of challenging scenario. One of the main points that you picked up on was that if this, is a harm reduction program, do the participants have capacity to consent? We spoke about intoxication being a factor that might affect their ability. That doesn't necessarily mean that if somebody has had a drink or if someone is using drugs that they can't give consent. There's a difference between intoxicated and incapacitated. So you need to work with the partners to understand the individuals that you're working with. And as you said, review the content, go back so it's not a one-time agreement. I think another kind of key point that you picked up on this was that well, I guess within the nature of the work where they want to share it, you've got potential program funders and individual donors, and these are people who are actively using the service, the harm reduction program. So there might be, going back to that thing of coercion, there might be pressure that they feel that this service would be withdrawn if they didn't comply and they didn't consent to their image, their videos being used. So we need to reassure them that their decision whether or not to consent does not affect in any way the services and support that they receive. And just, yeah, it's an opportunity for us to kind of check that power balance and where we are, check our power within that. So choices, lots of opportunities to discuss. And then, yeah, just the final thing is, it says, you know, the identities of the people in the films have been protected. And I think often when we're thinking about consent, that's the first thing we think of, like, will it expose their identity? But also you're asking people to share stories, and that's just as important as sharing an image of their face, if not more important. So don't think that just because we've protected their identities, and even if we use methods there to change the pitch of their voice, which we sometimes do in videos, they're still sharing their stories. So they need to be comfortable that those are going to be shared with this audience or another audience. Great. Yeah, I'm conscious about time. That's now 3 o'clock. Would you like us to feedback on the next two, or how would you like to do?
Well, first of all, I understand if some of you have to leave. So I want to thank you for joining us. And of course, thank you, Kate, for such an interesting and practical presentation. We can stick around for another 15 minutes if those of you want to stay. I suggest maybe skipping unless just giving more time for Q&A, and maybe skipping the second and third case studies. If you haven't yet done so, please click on the survey link on the chat. We'd love to get your feedback as always, and it helps us plan our next Aspire event. So let's stick around, and I'll pass it back to Kate for the next 10-15 minutes to just answer some Q&A.
Yeah,
if that's all right. We already got a question, if that's all right. Sorry, Jacob, do you want to maybe unmute yourself and ask so that?
Sure. I mean, the scenario B, we're assuming that we should be using these kind of workshop videos in a fundraising situation, and I'm saying, why are we thinking that it's ethical to do so?
Yeah, sure. Can you give me a little bit more information? Are you taking the position that it wouldn't be ethical to do so?
I'm saying that many times when we do fundraising, we use media, and here it's during a workshop of doing films, but it's a workshop with beneficiaries, and we're using that as in fundraising. And I'm saying we do the same thing many times with photos, and I'm wondering whether it's ethical for us as NGOs to be using media for fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. For the example of the case study that I provided, the videos that were created were actually filmed by the service users. So this is taken from a project that I was involved in. So in that sense, I think it's a more positive use of image or storytelling, in the sense that they're actively participating and deciding, having agency over what they want to film. And their personal stories are involved in that. It's difficult, right? Because when we are fundraising, one of the things that we're told to do as an organisation is get that beneficiary story across, because that's what can really have an impact. And I think that that's okay to do if we are considerate about how we're representing the people within this video. So I think this would be very different if the video was just of the the service users struggling, and it was kind of just documenting that. What it's actually showing is, as an organization, if you help fund us, these are the types of creative programs we can provide to support our service users holistically. So in my opinion, it's not just kind of an absolute rule against using these stories or videos or images, but really paying attention to how we do so and how we promote agency within the community groups to kind of direct those stories. So that's a very long-winded answer. Did anyone have, I'm sorry that groups 3 and 4 have not had the chance to feedback. I hope you still found that the exercise is useful. If anyone from those groups had specific questions, then we could kind of do it that way rather than feeding back on the entire case study.
And okay, we have 2 people who've raised their hands, so I'll start with them, and then anyone who wants to put a question in the chat or raise your hand, feel free. So Sarit.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much, Kate. It's been really informative and interesting. Mine isn't associated with the scenarios. It's just a problem that I keep running into and I haven't found a solution. I don't know if there is one out there, but when you take a consent form for a photograph, you generally take the person's name and signature. You actually have no idea who that consent form then relates to. You don't know what that person looks like. So if someone comes back 2 years later and says, you know what, actually I've decided I don't want my picture to be in it anymore, this is my name and this is my consent form and I want, to pull it out, you don't know who that's relating to. What if there's a group of people and one person says, I don't want to be in any pictures or videos, you encounter the same issue again, where you don't know, the consent forms and the people don't line up, essentially. So is there a way to circumvent this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important practical question, and I think there's various ways to do it. So it sort of depends on how you're storing both the materials, the photographs, if that's the content you were gathering, and the consent form. Because for organisations that I've worked for, we would have a database which stored both the photographs and then digital versions of the consent forms, and those can be linked so that we know that when we click on this consent form and it's talking about this person, then it's linked to JPEG entitled this number. So it's a kind of about having that system implemented in your organization. If you're not digitizing the consent forms, then it's just kind of linking them physically as well. But just to make that a bit, linking them physically. So perhaps on the consent forms, just having a note of the images that they refer to. But yeah, it does require you to be really organized in the way that you store both the materials and the consent forms, and have a system in place for doing that. Because as you say, the worst thing would be that somebody withdraws consent and you're like, okay, well, yeah, we completely agree that should happen, but you can't actually find the images. So that system should be in place before you begin capturing content. I don't think any of the resources that I have provided point to that exactly, but I'm really happy to try and find a bit more guidance with specific instructions on it and share that with Yale, who can then forward it on afterwards, if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Kenneth, hi.
Hi, Kate, and it was really a very thought-provoking session for us here in India. We really don't think a lot about consent and the whole formal legal aspect of it. I have one question and I have one comment. The question I have is, very often we think of the individual as a consent process, but very often, like in the case scenario number 2, you might be referring in your story to other people, family members, the community, or somebody else. How does that impact the consent? Because not everybody is in a vacuum. So there are references to other people. What about protecting the, part of people who are referred to in those stories? That's my question. My comment or my thought, which I shared with Jacob earlier today before we came on the on this session, was we work in a tribal area in India where illiteracy is rampant. I mean, people are not even educated up to the 3rd or 4th grade in villages, and consent is a very difficult thing for us. I was just wondering, as an organization, if we could, go to our communities and over a period of 3 months do a kind of discussion and study and have this conversation with the groups that we work with to see how they, as beneficiaries of donors or funders, how do they look at consent and how do they look at this whole thing from the paradigm of the receivers or the beneficiaries. So I was wondering whether it would be a worthwhile process or it would just be a futile thing. So these are my two, the question and my thought.
Yep, great. So just I'll break it into two. I'll start with the last part of your your question and then kind of go back to the first part, which you might need to remind me on. So yeah, I think that would be an amazing process and discussion to have with the communities that you're working with, if you're able to. Within the further resources, I don't know if some of you might have already seen it, but there's a research piece that was called People in the Pictures, which was a research study undertaken by Save the Children, who went back to communities where there had been content gathering, and particularly looking at photography, and discussed with the communities about how they felt about how they'd been represented, and a whole discussion around how that process had taken place, and would they change it differently, or how do they see informed consent. So I think definitely take a look at that, but certainly particularly when you're looking at kind of low literacy levels or low education levels, it would be so interesting to hear from the perspectives of the communities that you work with. And can you remind me of the first part of your question?
The question part was when, for example, in the case study 2, where these maybe drug users or anybody, they refer to other people, maybe a supplier or family member, because they don't live in a vacuum. So how are the rights of those people protected if one person signs that?
Third parties, yeah, really important point. I think, the thing with informed consent is that it's not black and white, and there is a lot of grey area. I think ethically, and again, to protect the participant and your organisation, you'd want to be ensuring that there was no identifiable information shared. So yes, one of the participants might talk about their drug supplier, but they don't identify who that person is. And if they do within the story, you need to kind of go back and maybe edit that and have that discussion with the participant, because that could put them at risk, it could put your organisation at risk. And then in terms of kind of more broadly, if they refer to other people, it's difficult, right? Because our stories are very subjective, and you can't necessarily, this isn't journalism, you're not going and fact checking everything that's within the story. So I think it's just, people have the right to tell their stories. So if you get to the point where you've protected the identity of those that they're talking about and had a discussion with them, if you talk about your brother, how are they going to feel about this? Would you like to change it? Your brother might see this. Then that's kind of how we need to approach it. I'm sorry, I don't kind of have a clearer answer, but more than that, yeah, I think all of our stories are quite subjective, so it is tricky.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks. Robin?
Hi. We have a quick question about, is there a statute of limitations? We have archives of old photos from 10 years ago, say, and clearly we have no idea who took the photo. We don't know if consent was ever given, but if we have a group of children in a school setting that's 10 years old and they're unidentifiable, is that something we should get rid of? Is it something we should tag as, can we use it in describing program? I don't know,
No, it's a really good question. And I'm not, are you based in the States?
No, we're based in Israel and we work almost exclusively in Ethiopia.
Okay, so you could have said any country there, because what my response there I was going to say is I don't know the guidelines for each specific country. I do know that most data protection guidelines do not put a limit on the time that you can keep materials for, or they don't put a specific, they talk about communicating that to the community group when you're capturing consent, so managing the expectations. But they often, so GDPR, as I said, the guidelines within the EU and the UK, it speaks about what is necessary and what is reasonable. So some more kind of gray area and unspecific language. I think as an organization, instead of, whilst we really need to pay attention to the guidelines and the legal framework, we need to kind of think about what's good practice. So you said the images you're talking about, the young people aren't identifiable within them.
No, I'm saying if it's a 10-year-old photo of a 10-year-old, are you harming that person now? Because they could see it, or somebody who knows them and say, on the other hand, they're not identifiable. I mean, I think there's an ethical issue here, and I'm, you know, glazing over some very important things, but
no, absolutely. I think what's really important would be that 10 years ago, when you captured that person's photograph and you went through that informed consent process, you spoke to that young person about the fact that you might be happy to share your image now, but how are you going to feel in 10 years' time? And that discussion took place because that's how that consent would have been informed. So
it certainly didn't take place, but it should from now on. That's, I think.
Well, maybe this is an opportunity then for you to, now that it sounds like you've got some better practices in place or you're beginning to implement them, is to refresh your content library and work kind of moving forward now. But again, just always think about the context that you're showing it in. How are you using that image? Is that likely to be something that the young person would be unhappy with, or are you using it in a positive way to promote this project that the young person was part of? So kind of context is everything. Yeah.
If I, in the last minute, if I could put Jen Lavelle from American Jewish World Service on the spot, and if you want to share just the new system you put in place, which could be of help of kind of how to keep track of who you're photographing and where they are.
Sure, thanks, Yael. A lot of credit goes to my colleague Liz, who's also on this call, but we have like a digital story bank where we store digitally all of our photos, and attached to the file is like the caption. So like left to right, these are the names of the people in the photo. This is kind of what's going on. And then here is the photo credit as well. Yeah. So we can update those also as time goes on. I don't know if you have anything to add, Liz.
No, I mean, yeah, we're working hard to improve our system around it all the time. Definitely better than it was a few years ago, but we also have a ways to go. Like, I think we still aspire to the ideal, but yeah, thanks, Jen.
Yeah, I mean, both really good suggestions. I think often it's easier to keep it organized if you do digitize your materials and your consent, and there's various ways of linking them. There's also tagging as well. So for projects I've worked on, I can go and I actually use Lightroom for a lot of the work, even though it might be kind of written materials, we can kind of scan and store it there. And if I bring up a participant's name or a pseudonym normally, then all of the images that they're either in or that they have created will come up. And that just helps you searching as well. And then you can have your various other tags related to issue or country. But yeah, it's a useful way to kind of keep the consent forms linked to the materials as well.
Thanks, Kate. Any closing words?
From myself?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sorry that we've kind of rushed through this. As I said, it really is kind of a starting point. I hope for you as organisations to improve or to begin to implement better practices around informed consent. So what I've kind of put together here on this slide is just some suggestions that you might take back to your organisation. I won't go through each of them. I think the third one's really important. So this is just kind of something to have in your head when you're thinking about gathering content. And then that's a lot of what we've discussed on is prioritize having a conversation with potential contributors before you bring out any paperwork or any consent recording. And then the final point was just if you found some of this information useful, or you have other resources you think people in the group would find useful, then share it with those involved in your organisation who are involved in content gathering. And that might be your comms teams if you have them, or it might be volunteers or students that you're sending off to work abroad and to gather content. Because if we want to promote ethical practice within development and aid organisations, it's really key that those who are involved in the storytelling are ethically literate. So yeah, share the knowledge. I think there's probably a wealth of knowledge in this room, so please do share it. And then you'll all get the slides afterwards. So I've provided some general resources. That's the one I was talking about, Kenneth, the people in the pictures, which I think you might find interesting. And then some examples of consent forms as well. Just consider these templates though, and maybe think about developing your own template as an organisation, but always tailor it to your projects and community groups that you're working with. And thank you. That was great. I really enjoyed that. I'd love to kind of learn more about the work that you're doing, and apologies that we kind of rushed through it so much, but I hope it was useful.
Thank you so much, Kate. I think it was extremely useful, and hopefully all of our partners and everyone who's here will put a time in your calendar, a few hours to start with, to sit together as a team, look at some of these examples and resources, and think about practical ways where you could, where you're doing well and where you could be doing better. So yeah, thanks again, Kate, and thanks to everyone. And we will be sending out this information shortly. So have a good rest of your day and take care.